My name is Liz Rosenberg. I direct the Energy Economics and Security Program here at the Center for New American Security. We are delighted to have you all for this event on excuse me, the financial networks of mass destruction, a showy name for this event, during which, of course, we'll be talking about the money trail for facilitating and supporting WMD proliferation. That is the financing of proliferation, and the rules and policies intended to identify this money flow and to stop it. We'll have particular emphasis on major state-based proliferation programs, Iran and North Korea. So today's event also coincides with release of a major, research report that a team of CNAS experts are releasing today. It's, I see many of you have it. It's in the entryway if you should like to take one. We have an excellent panel to discuss this topic. I'm awed and humbled to be able to be here with you all. I will introduce them shortly and we'll get into the conversation. But before we do that, I want to take a minute or two to set the stage for this topic. And in so doing, offer you a few of the takeaways from the report we published. And so I'd like to ask my colleague, Neil Bhatia, one of the co-authors on this report, to do that for us, offering just a few comments to set our stage. So, Neil, over to you.
Thanks very much. Welcome, everyone. As Liz said, I'll just take a few minutes to sort of set the stage for discussion today. I think the top-line message that we want people to take away from this project is that we all agree that WMD proliferation is an important issue to face, but the financing aspect of it, there's a real lack of awareness, I think, in the national security community in DC about the specific nature of that threat and how to face it. There are numerous documented cases of proliferation networks that have been able to penetrate not only the global financial system, but also the U.S. financial system to procure goods for WMD programs, including from many Western countries. As we'll hear from the panel, some of the most commonly discussed and insidious threats are from North Korea and Iran. Indeed, as we may know from the news, the North Korean proliferation networks have arguably been the most sophisticated and wide-ranging, but there are also numerous examples of Iranian and Syrian financial networks that have also been able to procure WMD goods, and in many instances using U.S. dollar transactions. I would just note a prominent recent example from Pakistan, which is interesting because, of course, the United States made a political and strategic decision in 2001 to remove sanctions that had been imposed on that country for its nuclear tests in 1998. But it still works very assiduously to acquire goods in violation of U.S. export control regulations. In 2016, three Pakistani nationals based in Connecticut used front companies both in that country and in here to purchase goods controlled by U.S. export regulations. They falsified end-user certificates and lied to U.S. manufacturers in order to acquire goods that were then reshipped to Pakistan for use by entities in that country's nuclear and ballistic missile research and development program. Efforts by the Pakistani military to continue to acquire goods in violation of U.S. regulations no doubt continue, which is not surprising. I think this highlights a current gap in how we think about proliferation finance, which is mostly a country-specific approach, where it's difficult enough to have the energy to go after the most notorious sanctions violators, let alone the countries that we're not paying as much attention to. In a larger sense, what we also want people to take away from this report is the loopholes that allow these networks to operate and the weaknesses in the regime basically boil down to countries falling into one of two broad categories. Either ones that lack the technical capacity to do something, or countries that can act effectively but choose not to for diplomatic or political reasons. In the former camp are many countries in places like Southeast Asia or Sub-Saharan Africa whose technical capacity to do financial crimes compliance is not as great, but at least they are aware of their obligations under international law. The latter category is a bit trickier and includes countries like China, which for economic or diplomatic reasons do not fully abide by UN restrictions on trade with North Korea. Just by way of wrap-up, the report offers a broad swath of recommendations for how the United States can help strengthen this regime. I'll just note three before handing it back to Liz. One has to do with financial transparency here in the U.S. For all that the report says about deficiencies in other jurisdictions, it also highlights remaining issues in U.S. law and regulation. Congress has still not acted to reduce ease with which anonymous corporate entities can be formed in the U.S., a fact which allows proliferators almost infinite source of front companies for them to acquire these goods. Second, I would note the U.S. has about 6 months left in its presidency of FATF, the main international body for strengthening the international response to a variety of financial threats, including proliferation finance. Before we turn over that presidency to China, we should do as much as we can to ensure that that organization is focusing on PF with the same alacrity with which it focuses on anti-money laundering. And last is expanding the scope of regulation beyond financial institutions. The recently published U.S. Interagency Proliferation Finance Risk Assessment is among the best distillations, I think, of the complexity of the proliferation finance threat. But even it focuses most of its legal and regulatory attention on financial institutions, which are only one part of the supply chain that proliferation networks rely on. The shipping and maritime insurance sectors, among others, do not face nearly the regulatory scrutiny that global banks do. And I think these two regimes must be better aligned going forward if we're to address this threat. With that, I think I'll turn it back, please.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Neil. There's a lot there which will help get us started in our conversation. By the way, for the people who came in, there's at least 2 more chairs up here. And may I just mention to you all, if you haven't already done so, could you silence your cell phone? So moving on to our panel, I'm going to introduce them, and then, as I said, we'll jump into a conversation for about 20 minutes or so, a little longer, and then another chair here as well. And then take questions from all of you who have joined us today in our audience. So to begin with, to my immediate left is Norm Rule, Senior Advisor to the Counter-Extremism Project and United Against Nuclear Iran. Previous to this role, he served in the intelligence community, including in the distinguished role of National Intelligence Manager for Iran at the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. To his left is Sarah Rungi, who is Head of FCC Regulatory Affairs and Exam Management at Credit Suisse, formerly at the Treasury Department, where she was most recently the Director of the Office of Strategic Policy within the Office of Terrorist Financing and Financial Crimes. And at the end of our row, we have Danny Glazer, who is a principal with the Financial Integrity Network, and prior to that, he worked in several senior posts in the United States government, most recently as the Assistant Secretary for Terrorist Financing and Financial Crimes. I am honored to host this group, colleagues of mine previously from the U.S. government, from whom I've learned a tremendous amount, and best-in-class experts and experienced practitioners in thinking about these challenges, and indeed in setting out much of the policy thinking that has defined the U.S. and the global approach to this problem in the past. So I thank you very much for being here and want to jump right in. So first I'm going to start with Norm. To set the stage a bit, and let's start first with Iran. Can you talk a little bit about how we see Iran exploiting licit and engaging in illicit financial activity to support the domestic weapons and nuclear programs? And is this something that continues today?
Thank you. It's an excellent question. I want to thank you for having me today. It's an honor to be with my colleagues here and to see so many familiar faces in the room. There's a lot of extraordinary minds sitting on the other side of this podium, and I'm thankful of that as well. This is a complex issue, but in many ways the topography associated with every aspect of this issue is fairly simple and easily understood. Something can be understood and seen as a knowable, but that doesn't mean you have a solution as to how to work through it. Iran is one of the most heavily sanctioned nations on the planet. Understood. Iran has a vast military system where it has attempted and successfully acquired missile parts from Europe and Asia. It has acquired sensitive drone material from Germany, Europe, and other places, and it has proliferated these technologies not only within its own government, but to surrogates in the region. Recently, the Houthis used a Qasif drone to kill the head of Yemeni military intelligence, the first such killing in the history of the world. by the way, a foreign security leader by a drone. That drone was based off of the Ababil drone, which was derived on based on technologies which appears to have come from other countries. So this is not just an Iran problem in many ways. This now becomes a Lebanese Hezbollah problem, a Houthi problem, et cetera, et cetera. Within Iran, there are only so many banks. You would think, well, that's a target easy to watch. There are only so many financial channels. Okay, there are only so many places that can provide this data. Now, shipping becomes complicated. Airline becomes complicated. But where this really becomes an issue is almost diplomatically. And I say that because it's one thing to say that we have China and Turkey, who are often countries involved in facilitating money transfers. You don't usually have the sort of security problems with Europe. There's not a lot going on in Africa or Latin America relating to Iran missile proliferation or drone programs. But you really need to have the hard diplomacy done to go to leaders of the countries that are host to this engagement and say, knock it off. That is hard and complicated. And it's not meant to say it's impossible, but likewise, it's not a simple démarche to the Chinese leadership. And some of you who have worked in the State Department have worked very hard to deal with Chinese officials and others to say, your banks are doing something they shouldn't. And the answer 6 or 7 weeks later, a few months later, is maybe we're not sure. And eventually, administration must make the hard choice of sanctioning a Chinese bank with perhaps ripples in other areas. So I would start off by saying this isn't that hard to understand, but the steps needed to solve it are significant. And if we don't solve it, you will see more of these technologies from Iran going to more surrogates in the region. And if a drone is used to attack Americans, it comes from this sort of technology. The financial aspect has some guilt for that operation.
Thank you. I want to turn to set the stage on North Korea and their channels for deriving revenue to support the missile and nuclear programs domestically. Danny, can I ask you to jump in on that? And then I want to ask you a question after that about evolution of policy to identify and to counter proliferation finance.
Sure, and let me echo what Liz said and what Norm said, what I'm sure Sarah's going to say about how great it is to be up here with you guys. It makes me very nostalgic. We all four of us have worked together to greater or lesser extent throughout our years in government. Norm and I were joking before we came up here that we've been at like thousands of meetings on this very subject, and we've been just like this close to solving it. So we're pretty confident that this meeting is going to be what pushes us over the top on it. I also kind of feel like I'm doing a stand-up comedy, but I will just say I wrote all these notes about what I wanted to say, and those notes are now in my shoulder bag, which are under my dining room table in my apartment right now. So I'm going to be kind of winging it, but so you're going to get the truth from me now. So North Korea. North Korea is an interesting problem set when you think about the concept of applying financial pressure. And I just want to preface this by saying, because I always say this whenever I talk about the application of financial measures and the application of financial and economic pressure on a target, whether it's an individual, whether it's a group, whether it's a jurisdiction. Financial pressure and sanctions are not a policy. It's not a policy. It's a tool to advance a policy. So you could have an extremely successful example of the application of financial pressure, and I would point to our Iran sanctions as an example of extremely effective pressure. It brought the Iranians to the table. Even the Iranians admit that it was financial pressure that's what brought them to the table, and you may be very unsatisfied with the outcome of that. Likewise with North Korea. North Korea is an example. It was the first example of the U.S. really being able to flex its financial muscle and apply extreme financial pressure on a target. And I don't think anybody is satisfied with where we are in North Korea right now. With perhaps one person I could think of who might disagree. But so I just want everybody to keep in mind as we're having this conversation that these tools that we're talking about are just that. They are tools. They are not a policy, and they serve a policy. And we cannot sanction our way out of or financially pressure our way out of very, very difficult political decisions, some of which Norm was alluding to as he was talking. So with respect to North Korea is a really interesting case study. When we devised our initial financial pressure strategy with respect to North Korea, back in, say, 2004, 2005 was when we first started thinking this stuff up. We understood that North Korea was very, very different, a very, very different problem set than Iran. And like with everything, a country's or a target's strengths are their weaknesses. Iran had very, very broad access to the International Financial Center, but that gave us something to take away from Iran. It was a target-rich environment in that sense. North Korea had limited access to the international financial system. Today, even more so, because of some of the things we did, 10 years ago. They have very, very limited access to financial system. That's in some ways a strength for North Korea because it kind of takes away things that you can take away from them. There's not as many targets, but when you do find that target, it's really, really powerful because they only have a few. So with Iran, it's about buying broad financial pressure on a jurisdiction that had broad access and that has a population with real commerce, with real something close to public opinion, and you're sort of playing in sort of that kind of game. With North Korea, it's about finding the point of pressure that you could put your finger on that's going to have real reverberating effects throughout sort of the North Korean system. With respect to North Korea, because again, because I could talk about this all day.
And we have.
But I'll just end with this, and then I'm sure we'll get into it more as we have our conversation. The problem that we face, that the United States faces, I still say we when I talk about the United States government, the problem the United States faces when confronting the challenge that is North Korean financial activity is that they only need a little bit of it, and they get what they need primarily through China. And so it becomes less of a financial pressure on North Korea question, because it's obvious how to put financial pressure on North Korea, and more of a China policy problem. And the problem with China policy is what's our most important issue with China? Is it trade? Is it North Korea? Is it South China Sea? Is it intellectual property? We have a wide array of issues, and even once you say North Korea is the number one issue, and you can make a case that North Korea is the number one issue, you can make a case it's not. But even if you say North Korea is the number one issue, then you get into a whole set of difficulties with respect to getting China to see things our way, because we just can't. There's very few countries that we can force, but we can't force a lot of countries to do what we want to do. We certainly can't force China. China doesn't see North Korea the way we see North Korea. It's not to say that they prefer nuclearized North Korea. I doubt that they do. But they don't see the problem the way we see the problem. And it becomes very, very hard to get them to take that last step of putting their finger on these nodes that would have significant impact within the North Korean system, because I do believe that the only financial pressure that would work on North Korea is financial pressure that puts an existential amount of pressure on them, because they see the nuclear program in existential ways. So with that...
Okay. Actually, so I just want to note that the both of you have mentioned China as a critical conduit for the building and continued support for state-sponsored WMD programs. So we'll keep focus on that going forward. The next question I want to ask, let me put to Sarah and Danny, to both of you. Okay. So looking back at the last couple of decades of the policies and regulations that exist at the international law, at the international level, primarily, as well as some state leaders, individual countries that have been leaders on this topic, what is not permitted? What does the landscape of policy look like in its evolution that seeks to identify and to stop proliferation finance? Just noting out of the box that, for example, proliferation finance isn't criminalized as such most places in the world. Let's start from there, and can you give us start with a broad snapshot of how you see the policy regime at this moment? Sarah, if you want to start.
I'll start. Yeah, and I'm glad you asked that, because I was going to pick up on sort of the opening comments about, political will versus technical capacity. There's a third element, which is global obligations associated with proliferation financing, which there is a huge gap compared to terrorist financing. And, so I work at a Credit Suisse. It's a Swiss bank. We actually implement OFAC at a policy level globally. That's the way we operate as an institution. But there are real challenges in terms of, for just even risk assessments, understanding risk related to proliferation financing. That's not something that's obligated globally. SAR filing in a lot of jurisdictions related to PF is actually very clearly not allowed in certain circumstances, not only because of lack of criminalization. Some jurisdictions actually do criminalize, but they still do not expect, there's not a link between the SAR filing. So if you just think about the way we all think in the U.S. about information, how we gather it from financial institutions, how we understand risk, if banks are only filing SARs in the context of direct hits or a blocking order.
Let me pause. Just there's some initiated and some uninitiated here. So SARs for people who.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Suspicious activity reports.
And
sorry.
And just as a brief background, and with apologies to all of those of you who file SARs for a living. So, can you just the obligations to file a SAR as part of an anti-money laundering program?
So, one of the sort of basics of a framework globally for how it is that and expectations for governments relates to financial institutions' obligations to file a report associated with specific risks they may identify in their financial institution. There's a whole other huge discussion about how that works, but at the end of the day, these are reports that are filed with financial intelligence units and ultimately then accessed by law enforcement and others in order to initiate further investigations related to money laundering and terrorist financing, and then the open question here is proliferation financing. So anyway, there is a real question here, and I think an important one, because as it is, I think the world is divided pretty starkly between governments and financial institutions that view implementing whether UN obligations associated with sanctions or other as a rules-based versus a risk-based perspective, and it's a fundamental point because a lot of governments and therefore their banks basically view their obligations to say either there's a direct hit associated with this name and this is all about name screening, or it's a much broader conversation around how you actually identify that activity. How do you conduct due diligence in the context of your anti-money laundering program in order to identify this type of activity, which is far more difficult. But honestly, a lot of governments don't do that. And just one last thing I'll say on this, which relates to also in Neil's opening remarks, the U.S. illicit finance strategy, money laundering risk assessment, terrorist financing risk assessment, and the first global proliferation financing risk assessment. And from my perspective, and not just because I used to work there, it's incredibly important because the reason the U.S. took a view to develop that wasn't only because it was sort of suggested in the legislation, but more importantly, we wanted to set a standard and an expectation for how it is that jurisdictions can undertake a national PF risk assessment and actually start thinking through, as a jurisdiction, what are the different ways you think about risk, and then this thing goes to how your financial institutions take that information and identify that activity. And that is absolutely lacking, in part due to global obligations.
Let me draw this out for 1 second, and I'm going to come to you. Okay. So what we have here, just to bring us to sum up a couple of pieces here, we have at least a couple of major global state-based proliferation programs that are broadly understood to be major threats to global peace and security, recognized at times and in various ways by the United Nations, with including sanctions obligations on all member states. We also have, and that includes sanctions on North Korea, Iran. Let's just park that for a second. That has changed at the UN level, of course. But and then there is, but as you've just pointed out, there's uneven international requirements about understanding the threat and obligations to take action on it.
So I'm sorry to interrupt, but I want to add one thing. I'm not sure there's a uniform assessment of the threat. Iran's missile program is perceived very differently by different players in the world, and much of that is where you stand is where you sit. Mm-hmm. If you're in Moscow, your view is a missile is not nuclear capable unless it has a nuclear weapon on it. If you're in Israel, you have a very much broader definition. In the United States, you have all the definitions at once, depending upon where people stand on the Iran issue. And I think in the banks in those countries, they have that leadership top-down view of this is kind of okay because this is strategic deterrent. This isn't an offensive tool.
So on the definition issue.
Well, let me just back. I think this all needs to be framed. So since I somehow grown into the role of sort of institutional memory on anti-money laundering in Washington, so when you go back to before 9/11, John, you can do this very quickly, but when you go back to before 9/11, we had an anti-money laundering regime. We didn't have an AML-CFT regime. We had an anti-money laundering regime, and there was push to incorporate terrorist financing. The United States government was against it. The United States government was against putting CFT in with AML because we were like, well, what exactly, except for a couple of small things, is going to make it any different? And then after 9/11, there became this political imperative to incorporate CFT. So now countering terrorist financing in addition to anti-money laundering. There became this political imperative. So you go to the FATF, the Financial Action Task Force, the International Standards Setter for anti-money laundering and now terrorist financing. And the United States says, well, now we have to, 180 degrees, overnight, 180 degree shift. Now we have to include CFT into this framework. Okay, so look what FATF did. 8 special recommendations don't exist anymore. Now they've been incorporated into the AML-CFT standards, but at the time there were 8 special recommendations. If you want, you can go back and look at them. In the whole scheme of things, they're really not that big a deal. You look at charities. Make sure that certain AML anti-money laundering obligations extend to money remitters, and make sure that certain obligations extend to
charities.
Charities. They were important, but they weren't fundamental. And then 5 years later, the United States comes back to the Financial Action Task Force, and the United States says, now we need to include proliferation finance in these standards. It's imperative. And people then looked at the United States and said, well, exactly what do you mean? What additional requirements are you talking about that relate to terrorist finance, that relate to proliferation finance that don't relate to AML-CFT? And at the time, I was morally offended even by the question. But now that I'm no longer in the government, I can say, there's really not that much. There's really not that much. And so when you look at the very, very important recommendations that are in this and that Sarah's referring to, they're really tightening up the AML regime. They're tightening up the AML regime. Corporate formation, beneficial ownership. That's an AML issue. Cross-border wire report. That's an AML issue. These are all big. And then you have a few things to do at the margins to sort of bring in proliferation finance in a more robust way. So I think it's important when we're talking about the framework issues. To remember that what we're really talking about is tightening up and doing some really, really important stuff on money laundering. When we really move into the proliferation finance, and one of the questions that got asked of the United States when we were at FATF is, what do you mean by proliferation finance beyond enforcing Iran and North Korea sanctions? What does it actually mean? The Russians asked us this question. The Chinese, in all earnest. I don't even think they were gaming us. They're like, what exactly do you mean? The Germans asked us the same question. What do you mean beyond Iran and North Korea? Is there such a thing as counter-proliferation finance beyond your efforts, important efforts, to try to denuclearize Iran and North Korea? What does it actually mean? And I don't know that there's a great answer for that question, which gets me to my final point, which I do think that when we talk about issues like Iran, like North Korea, and their proliferation regimes, there's 2 things we need to talk about. We need to talk about broad anti-money laundering, tightening up anti-money laundering, and getting countries to have the political will to actually implement financial pressure on these jurisdictions. And that's fundamentally a political will issue. When I used to go around Asia and interact with governments on North Korea, and I would walk into an Asian government and I would say, do you realize don't you realize North Korea's trying to develop nuclear weapons? And they'd look at me like shrugging their shoulders, and I'm like, do you know that they're trying to also counterfeit US $100 notes? And they'd be like, are you serious? They're trying to counterfeit US $100 notes? That's a casus belli. You could go to war with them for that. I got more of a reaction on the counterfeiting than I did out of the nuclear weapons. So fundamentally, this becomes a question of political will. I really think the questions on Iran and North Korea are questions of political will.
Okay, so I'm just going to take from that when the Chinese and the Germans, et cetera, are saying in all sincerity, what do you mean? What do you mean? Like, why should we be concerned with some proliferation, the financing for proliferation beyond obligations for North Korea and Iran? So ignoring the examples Neil was pointing out regarding South Asia or Syria, or having a more expansive version even of looking after North Korean and Iran proliferation just besides what is sanctioned, that in fact that's a political will issue. But hold on one second. Okay. Sarah wanted to jump in.
I just wanted to say, and maybe it's a different way of saying the same thing, Danny, rather than disagreeing with you, but
You could disagree with me too, though.
Well, but I think we might be thinking and saying the same thing. I don't personally view addressing these issues as tightening the AML regime. I think it has to do with now a broad global recognition that a strong and effective AML program is the foundation to effectively identifying either sanctions evasion, individuals even on the list,
That's
right?
Exactly what I'm saying.
So I think we are saying, but I guess from my perspective, it's now you can't. I don't think institutions should separate a strong AML program from their sanctions obligations, because fundamentally knowing who your customer is, how much enhanced due diligence you conduct, how many pieces you put together to really develop an understanding of how they operate, not just globally but within your institution, are foundationally what we think of AML, but I think it's all now completely together.
Yeah, no, this is getting to advanced stuff. Yeah, I completely agree with Sarah, but that's getting to advanced stuff. But I agree, sanctions and AML are intricately related.
Okay, so this brings us to a point I want to talk about with you all before we then move into questions from this audience. I hope you are with us here. We're mixing the advanced course and the basic course here. Well, we'll stick with us here. We'll keep at it. But something I want to talk about with you is, so we all understand that, of course, for any proliferation program to exist, to continue, it requires money. There are a mix of international obligations and national obligations that get at this. Some of the challenges that exist in this domain is that there's no international agreement, maybe that's a little bit of a stretch, but about exactly what the problem is and how it shall be addressed in international law at the national level. Even in the case of FATF, what you have described, the international standard setting body for AML, there's some differentiation of views about how to come at this problem, which of course has a bearing on the obligations that are put in place by national governments to do so. But who's at the front line? So in this international picture where there's some differentiation on definition and legal standards and obligations, who is then trying to see the flags of the financing of proliferation in the flow of global commerce and transactions? And here I'm talking about the private sector primarily. So commercial actors, banks, they are looking at this broad global ongoing conversation and some different views and different legal obligations and expectations. What does it look like for a financial institution, particularly in these high-risk jurisdictions, coming back to China, that may not want to be involved in this, either because they have a legal obligation not to, or they have legal liability for doing so, or just because it's a reputational matter, they don't want to be involved or have their system be abused. So if financial actors are the front line and there's this variegated view towards definition and obligations, how do companies come at this? And they're looking at your drone example and the potential that this, the maybe almost a surety that this will continue. How do you what do you do to get after it? So this is the 30,000, the 101 version. How do financial institutions come at this particular issue?
I'll add one tweak to that. The bad guys, and these are bad guys, okay, anybody who's giving a weapon to Hezbollah or the Houthis, those aren't good guys. They operate dozens of front companies. They very quickly change names of companies. They are very adept at using financial institutions. They routinely use financial institutions that are involved in humanitarian activity because it buys them the protection that comes with that. They routinely use governments and middlemen who are willing to falsify paperwork. So in my world, it was always probably a lot easier than in the banking sector. It's very simply a question of, the IRGC, for example, is using Joey's wheat croissant and missile part company in Beirut to purchase things from somewhere, and the moment that happens, the Russians say it's not nuclear. Someone else will say you're denying wheat to some poor Iranian, and then 6 weeks later that company disappears or comes up on a new name. So if I'm sitting in Credit Suisse or somewhere, you have an endless flow of documentation coming in, and I'll close on this point. We often look at this as if this is our problem. It's the United States that's imposing tough sanctions on the Iranians, et cetera, et cetera. This is an Iranian problem. If the Iranians weren't using their companies, their structures, their banks to use this nefarious activity, banks wouldn't be so afraid of dealing with the Iranian government. But because there's such a deep, well-documented history, well-documented, and I've been in a lot of the conversations as Danny with foreign governments to say this is going on, you almost have to be a little foolish if you're in a banking industry to say, I will deal with the Iranian government because these guys pull the fast one so often.
So before I let the Swiss banker answer the question on behalf of the banking sector,
compliance person.
I think Hezbollah is a completely different conversation. Hezbollah is
different than North Korea, or just different under its own?
Different from North Korea and different. Each target presents their own issues and challenges. And Norm's exactly right. Hezbollah is an international conglomerate that does banking in Europe and in North America and in South America and in Asia and in the Middle East, and that's a whole problem set unto itself. If we're talking about China, where Hezbollah does banking also, but they do have banking everywhere. But if we're talking about China and talking about quote unquote banks in China, there's banks. There's many banks in China. So talking about banks in the United States, you could talk about Citibank, or you could talk about like First National Bank of Omaha. Those are two completely different problem sets. And the same thing presents itself with respect to China. So you have the four big Chinese banks, and they're some of the biggest banks in the world, if not the biggest banks in the world. Right. These are international, state-of-the-art banks, international banks that operate under the same pressures in the international financial system and are deterred and incentivized by the same forces that deter and incentivize Credit Suisse or Citibank or HSBC. And then you have this mid and even small banks that are not as connected to the international financial system, that are much, much harder to deal with. And that's your real problem when you're dealing with North Korea, is the small and medium-sized banks in China that are not incentivized and not deterred by the same things that a Bank of China. Now, look, I think there's broad supervisory and regulatory issues in China, and I think that even the big banks in China are going to have a day of reckoning in the same way that many of the European banks did, many of the U.S. banks did with respect to the U.S. Justice Department and with respect to U.S. regulators, which, by the way, and again, this is a whole other conversation, is the only thing, it's the only enforcement in the entire system, anywhere, is what happens in New York is the only enforcement in the entire system, and that's what keeps the system honest. With respect to the banks that aren't exposed to New York, the small and medium-sized banks in China or elsewhere, that's where you really need to be concerned about your North Korean proliferation finance, or even your Hezbollah finance for that matter. Not that you don't have to be concerned about the larger banks, but there's ways of dealing with it. There's really no way of dealing with those other banks except to get China to deal with it, which then gets to what we were talking about before.
Okay, so a day of reckoning for particularly for Chinese banks, particularly regional and smaller Chinese banks. I share that view. Sarah, I want to give you the last opportunity for us in this conversation, and then we're going to open it up to all of you. So if at that time you have a question, you can just put your hand up and let me know. But to you, Sarah.
Thank you. So a couple things that Danny said, and then it was really a perfect segue to what I was going to say. I think, look, the first is, I think just as we talk about this discussion, it's really important to also think a little bit differently about where Europe and European banks are, given the desire for the governments in Europe and the financial institutions and business in Europe to continue and expand business in Iran, right? So I think as we talk about this conversation, it's always really important to have that policy underlay. Now, the large institutions are not really willing to play that game at this juncture, but I think it's just an important sort of sidebar about, because it's different when you have a government with a very strong view on these things versus one that is somewhere in the middle. The other thing I want to say, which is to push back a little bit on global enforcement, I mean, what's been very interesting to me just in the last 6 months, we have the Hong Kong Monetary Authority hitting JPMC and Hong Kong with a fine. I saw today that the French supervisor just hit Western Union in France with an enforcement action related to terrorist financing concerns. These are nowhere near a DPA level or DOJ level, but
which is to say a U.S.
a U.S. enforcement action, and a big bad one from the Department of Justice, which includes a fine and a huge remediation plan that can go on in perpetuity in certain circumstances. But it is to say that I do think, and it's not specific to a sanctions issues, however, I do think the Financial Action Task Force, as Danny said, the global standard setter, with an expectations on countries now that they can actually show how they're effectively implementing their obligations. That's a very specific requirement now. What we're starting to see is countries, really all countries, that honestly, traditionally, as Danny said, were silent on any sort of enforcement action in the public realm from a supervisor, are now coming out to be able to demonstrate that they have an effective program. And I just think it's interesting and important because you do start to see a shift, and you start to see the countries that are coming out with these as the next ones that are in line to be assessed by FATF. So there does seem to be a direct correlation between some of these actions and what's going on. So anyway, there's that. Now, in terms of
can I just say so another
do it again? Sorry.
No. So another day of reckoning, which makes the financial institutions try and get very focused and ahead of this challenge, is not just an enforcement measure, big bad one from the United States or from a different authority, but also being given a bad grade by FATF, the global standard setter body, on proliferation finance and other AML concerns.
Yes.
Go on.
Yes. So then following up to what Danny was saying about where different institutions are and risk related to PF in particular, I think this is also the way I've been thinking of it in the context of Credit Suisse. And I think, look, we in the U.S., and I think as we've all sat around and talked about these issues, we think about them primarily in the context in the U.S. of U.S. dollar clearing. A lot of that in terms of identifying sanctions evasion activity. So I've gone to a bank that doesn't dollar clear. We only do retail banking in Switzerland. However, we international wealth management, private banking, otherwise known as ultra-high worth individuals. And so starting to think about risk differently, but it's equally important. So rather than maybe starting out with a non-account holder in some circumstances, but actually account holders in everyone, not necessarily a corporate entity, but an individual, and then trying to put all the pieces together about that individual. And as I said before, not just in terms of how they're operating globally, but even within our financial institution. And a big thing that Credit Suisse has been developing, which for the uninitiated, one of the greatest challenges global banking face, industry and then also with government, is an inability to know actually who is operating within your financial institution at a global level. Bank secrecy, data privacy, and tipping off provisions globally frequently prevent a global financial institution such as ours, but anyone, to know if Sarah Runge holds an account or is booked a certain activity in Zurich, how else I'm operating in Singapore, in London, and as a result, imagine the risk as a financial institution. I can't even pull the strings to know how all these pieces are. Did we offboard Sarah for something? how do you communicate that? There are huge issues, and Credit Suisse is actually developing what we call single client view, but is an enterprise-wide system to basically put all this together. So not just understand how Sarah is operating within our bank, but then what's the spider web of transactions associated with Sarah in the bank? And this is incredibly difficult. It's an ongoing discussion within our institution, but I love the fact that we're doing it. This is a conversation as a policymaker I was part of for an incredibly long time, and the challenges are real, but I always think this is fundamental, right? As a financial institution, I'm prohibited because of certain laws from knowing how my customer is operating within my institution. It's extraordinary.
So on that frightening note, how are we meant to address these massive national security challenges if financial institutions can't even understand what the activity is? Okay, so let's move to your questions. We'll start and take Barbara and then go to you. We have a mic. So when you, for everyone, when you go ahead, please let us know your name before your question. Thank you.
Thanks. Barbara Slavin from the Atlantic Council. Wonderful panel. Many questions. There's a procurement channel that was set up by the JCPOA. Has Iran been using it? This is for any kind of nuclear-related material, and does that alleviate some of your concerns as long as Iran is still within the deal? Iran is about to finally pass FATF required legislation on AML-CTF. What does that imply for the safety of dealing with Iran? And finally, does the U.S., as the country that unilaterally left the JCPOA and reimposed sanctions, have any obligation to help identify channels for legitimate humanitarian trade with Iran? You spoke about Iran misusing front companies, but there are real needs in Iran that are currently not being met. What is the U.S. obligation? I would put this to Danny also and to Sarah. What is the U.S. obligation to help identify channels that will be clean and can be used for these purposes? Thanks.
Thank you.
So I'll speak very quickly. An interesting anecdote, and we have some people who actually participated in some of these discussions and actually would know it far better than I do in some of the details. But during the discussions, when it came to the joint procurement channel, the Iranians were pretty clear. We get it. For our nuclear program, we've got to send things through this channel. We get it. But you know, if a company sells something to us that's dual purpose, we don't have to take this to the procurement channel. So I mean, there's a sense of, we know you think I should take it to the procurement channel, and those discussions go back and forth. But unless it's a very clear example of a pencil going into Natanz, well, that's something the company's responsible for. And then, by the way, the governments behind that are responsible for it. The Iranians have made no bones in every discussion they've been in over the years. They will violate sanctions aggressively because they do not believe the sanctions are reasonable or they believe they're politically driven. And they have violated them repeatedly in the United States, acquiring material that put people in prison for their military programs. It's how they work.
For nuclear, since the JCPOA.
I'm not going to talk about that, okay? But I should just say, because I don't talk about classified information, those issues in a room, Barbara, let's just stick with the framework of the Iranians routinely violate sanctions for a variety of reasons, and they don't stop. But the JCPOA puts some strong restrictions in place that I think are very wise, and if the Iranians have to work through that, it's a good program. On the Iranian banking side of this, the United States government, I've been involved in dozens of conversations, maybe hundreds along with Danny, where we have said banks can sell soybeans and medicines to Iran. But the problem is the banks have a risk issue where they say the company to which we're selling is owned by the IRGC, and they're actually also importing weaponry and supporting Hezbollah or Kataib Hezbollah or the Houthis and others. How do you unpack that? I'll leave that to other people. The United States has said repeatedly, and I actually agree, that a country that is so imaginative and innovative and aggressive in violating sanctions successfully should certainly be able to come up with an imaginative, innovative, and aggressive effort to legally acquire soybeans and penicillin, especially since you have a European Union that is so interested in ensuring legitimate trade continues. So this, in some ways, it's also their problem. It's not just our problem, but the conversations always turn to it's the United States that has a responsibility for having a government which, and JCPO is based on the framework of they lied to the United States and will continue with a number of restrictions in perpetuity because they're not trusted. The whole framework of JCPO is we don't trust Iran. So we can't start trusting Iran on these issues. It's up to Iran to do their part as well.
Let me just jump in on that. Look, I think the humanitarian issue is not a red herring. The humanitarian issue is a very important issue. I think the humanitarian issue is a red herring with respect to Iran. Now, as everyone knows, there's an exemption to all U.S. sanctions, including Iran, with respect to food and medicine. That, as Barbara points out and as Norm points out, that doesn't mean that banks have to finance these transactions, and usually banks don't want to finance these transactions. But there has never been an issue with respect to getting food and medicine to Iran. There has always been an ability to get food and medicine in Iran. There's been distribution issues once it gets to Iran, but there's never been any sort of humanitarian issue. We do need to remember that the point of sanctions is to make things hard for the country. That's what it's. It's to make things hard for the country. And if it makes things so hard in certain areas, then you need to address it. But the humanitarian issue with respect to sanctions interfering with humanitarian assistance is, I think, a red herring on Iran. It's not a red herring in Somalia. It's not a red herring in Yemen. It's not a red herring in conflict zones in Syria. Those are real issues that we need to think very, very hard about. But I just do not accept the fact that it's that Iran has not been able to get food and medicine. There's absolutely no evidence to support it. With respect to the issue of Iran's impending enactment of FATF-compliant AML-CFT laws, first of all, I'll believe it when I see it, and they haven't done it yet, and I don't believe they are going to do it. They've been about to do it for about 2 or 3 years now. Right. They've been about to do it, and maybe they'll ultimately get there, and that will be an important step, an important first step for Iran. But as everybody knows, passing FATF-compliant AML-CFT laws and issuing FATF-compliant AML-C regulations is just the first step towards complying with the FATF standards, which require effective implementation. I think Iran, for a wide variety of reasons, including some of the reasons why Norm pointed out, is a long way from that, which is why Iran and some people at the U.S. State Department seem to think that a political agreement was going to change the way banks fundamentally looked at an AML-CFT compliance issue, but that was always a false expectation on everybody who believes it. It will remain a false expectation. There is not a political solution to Iran's exclusion from the international financial system. There is only a technical solution to it, which is to start complying with AML-CFT laws and regulations in a very, very meaniful way, and for there to be a fundamental shift in the way international governments, including the United States, view Iran as a responsible member of the International Financial Committee and the international community as a whole.
Do you want to say anything else on FATF? Okay, so we're going to move next to Rick. Yep.
Hi, Rick Cupid, Stimson Center. It certainly was my experience at State and elsewhere that the FATF mutual evaluations were drivers. But one of the things that we experienced, and I think is still the case, especially among lower capacity jurisdictions, is they would come to us and ask, can you give us help? What do we do? And the answers to that question that we were able to give frequently was not much. We can't really help you very much. Is there something you see? Do you see that changing? Is there some way that clearly there's some new interest at the FATF level in that, but is there some way to address these jurisdictions' concerns about, okay, we have some political will, but we would like to know what to do exactly and how to do it? Thanks.
It's a great question. Thank you. Maybe I'll ask Danny and Sarah to speak to that, but I'm also going to tag on here with moderator's privilege to ask you to also speak a little bit more about the issue of technical capacity and requesting help and technical assistance and training in that way versus political will more broadly. So to the two of you, Sarah, do you want to start?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and I think, look, the U.S. has been very engaged at a technical level. So I do think there are different paths along this road. So certainly our old office used to engage very actively with jurisdictions from a legal, technical perspective in terms of, draft laws being compliant. And I should also say we have to sort of ring fence what we're talking about. So there are currently 40 recommendations. FATF assesses that basically 6 of them are what are considered priorities in terms of foundational systems. So that's criminalization of money laundering, terrorist financing, UN implementation of UN obligations for PF, terrorist proliferation financing, terrorist financing, customer due diligence obligations, SAR filing obligations, and record keeping. So maybe that's 7.
That was impressive. Helpful.
But in any event, as a result of those being sort of red flags within your assessment process for issues, those are areas that jurisdictions focus on more than others, and as a first step, and I think that makes sense. So this is a long way of saying, in response to your question, when it comes to those issues in particular, the U.S. engaged very actively, first at a legal level, and then I'm also in part looking at Richard Burkhardt, who's at the IMF now, but the World Bank and the IMF historically have provided an incredible amount of technical assistance on the legal side. Now, one caveat I'll make to that in the context of this discussion is proliferation financing, where there has absolutely been a global gap around capacity to provide technical assistance. Part of this gets to some internal challenges at the IMF and the World Bank in terms of their mandate and delivering that. But I will say, sort of to end in a positive note, there is a Financial Action Task Force training center that was set up in Busan, I guess 2.5, maybe 3 years ago. And this is a key focus of theirs. They've developed a training program across on a number of issues, but focused on proliferation financing. And I understand that's something that in order to address this issue, because it's not really fair for us as an organization to say, you are terrible at this, and by the way, there's nobody who's going to help you get there, right?
So a couple things. I completely agree with what Sarah said. They're actually, I'd be happy to give you my business card. Now that I'm in the private sector, you could pass my business card on to these countries that need help understanding all of this. There are a lot of resources out there for jurisdictions that really want to avail themselves. As Sarah said, the IMF and the World Bank, and there's regional development banks that provide assistance. The United States provides a lot of assistance. The European Union provides assistance. Every one of these countries that you're talking about is a member of a FATF-style regional body. They are oftentimes very helpful in coordinating assistance. So there are resources. There are regional bodies that I could rattle off that provide assistance. So there is assistance out there for countries that are really interested in availing themselves of it. I will say, just maybe on a down note, every country should have needs a modern financial system. But for those countries that are going out there and building, trying to set themselves up as international financial centers, there is a high cost of entry into that. Any country that wants to do it should have the right to do it, but they need to understand there's a high cost of entry. And just setting yourself up as an international financial system and saying, why won't anybody help me comply with the FATF standards, is not an acceptable answer. It's simply not. When you set yourself up as an international financial center, you need to build AML-CFT into your foundational plan. And if you don't, then it's going to be much more expensive to do it down the line.
And it particularly looks like a political will problem.
Yeah, I think it's a political will problem.
Just to stay obvious here. So let's move to another question. Did you have one here in the front? And then I saw Sandy as well, and then we'll move to some of these others. Yep. In the green? Yep.
Hi, I'm Charles King Mallory from the RAND Corporation, and I'm working on a project right now helping a number of African governments with capacity building to counter terrorist financing. And I have kind of 2 short questions. Yeah, sure. 2 quite short questions. The first question is, do you think there's a risk that with time, as the U.S. continues to exercise its financial leverage, that some country or another will develop a clearing system that is completely ring-fenced from the U.S. financial system? And the second question I have is one of targeting. I mean, when we're dealing with these African governments, their ability to kind of keep track of these pop-up front companies, second-party intermediaries, individuals, cash which is carried to banks, including Credit Suisse, by the way.
Ouch.
Keep going, keep going.
It's
You took it.
She's only been there, sure.
It's very, I've seen it. It's very limited. And so my question about targeting is, when we went after the anti-money laundering of Banco Delta Asia, the reason that was effective is because there was one account there that really mattered. Office 38, the private account of the leader. And similarly, there are countries in Africa which continue to receive $700, $800 million a year from the United States, despite the fact that we've demarched them repeatedly on continuing to do business with DPRK. So my question is, are we really asking too much of people with limited capacity, including the private sector, including large banks like Credit Suisse, when there might be actually richer, higher leverage targets we could be going after? Thank you so much.
Well, you said two quick questions, but actually those are great questions, and they are expensive. And I'm really glad that someone cut right in and asked about, your first question. Let's go straight to the matter of is the United States going to get undercut by an alternative, a truly alternative, walled-off clearing system? Happily, maybe we do have an outstanding set of people to ask this question to from a technical perspective. Shall we start with that one first and then come to the second one?
I have a strong view on this one. Look, you put your finger on an important issue, as Liz said, and that is that the reason why the United States the United States has enormous leverage in the world because we are the custodians of the reserve currency in the world, the U.S. dollar. That gives us an enormous amount of leverage. And the concern has always been that if you use that leverage too much, you'll start to diminish that leverage. I have to tell you, it's currently not a big concern of mine. Now, as I said, with respect, there's micro examples of that concern. So can you have a small bank in China that's sort of set up to just do transactions with North Korea, and it's not really connected to the international financial system, doesn't really need dollars? Those are micro issues. But the fact of the matter is the dollar is the reserve currency today. The dollar is going to be the reserve currency next year. It's going to be the reserve currency in 5 years. It's going to be the reserve currency in 10 years. Is it going to be the reserve currency in 50 years? I don't know. But what I do know is that, or what I do very strongly believe, is that if it's not the reserve currency in 50 years, it's not going to be because of U.S. sanctions policy. There's massive macroeconomic issues that cause countries and large institutions to want to transact in dollars. And as long as the United States is generally viewed as a responsible custodian of the dollar, that aspect of it is not going to change. Now, again, there might be, and I'm sure there will be, forces that drive one thing or another, but it's not going to be U.S. sanctions policy, as long as there's not this perception that we're just completely crazy, which under current circumstances is a problem, but that doesn't go to U.S. sanctions policy. All right, so there's...
May I just interject to say, my takeaway from what you've just said with respect to the conversation we're having about proliferation finance is that for the foreseeable future, the United States will have a tremendous amount of leverage and influence in setting restrictions or guidelines on countering the financing of proliferation, and that's a very meaningful notion for U.S. policymakers in how they approach financial policy, particularly with respect to global institutions that may be in these high-risk jurisdictions, such as China.
So I've got to dive in and say a little bank that has no connection to the United States, and also Russia is another actor that does this, can finance a deal that provides a specific technology which significantly can advance a modestly sized industry in a malign actor. So I'm not. I grouped everything you said.
I know I'm talking too much. Just real quick, because it's an important point. When I think about pressure policy and when I think about sanctions or financial measures, I think about it in two ways. There's the efforts to apply broad financial pressure on a target, and you apply that broad financial pressure, understanding that there's going to be cracks. But it doesn't change the fact that Iran can't run its economy on a transaction here and a transaction there. This creates broad pressure. Then there's sort of the cat and mouse game of where you're trying to actually prevent a transaction from occurring, or you're trying to prevent a particular network from operating effectively. That's a much tougher. That's a much tougher question. If Iran or North Korea or Hezbollah or anyone really wants to conduct a transaction, they're going to figure out a way to conduct that transaction. And that becomes much more of an intel issue and a law enforcement issue than it does really sort of a financial sanctions issue, although financial sanctions do play a supporting role in that context. Where they play the lead role is on the broad pressure strategies.
Actually, that's a very useful point. Do you want to take the second question, Sarah, about are we asking too much?
You know, look, I think everybody has to do as much as they can. I think that's the right answer. Do I think that for many years banks have been perceived as the stopgap for all things, as the front line? And I say that because it's not that I don't think that there's an important role for banks to play, but as this discussion has identified, there are a lot of other nodes along this trail, and certainly even other covered financial institutions, supervisors frequently defer to banks to de facto oversee and supervise them, right? So I think there is a lot of tension, and I think banks are certainly, look, it's clear that global banks have invested and have appropriately invested in developing strong programs, not just because they're going to get hit over the head, but because most of us actually want to do the right thing and are full of former government people. That said, and this is true of governments now too, like collectively we do need to find ways to equalize the risk. And I think both when I was at Treasury and now, I think there's more that government can do to sort of look at some of these issues and find ways to say, look, we want you to do everything. We want you to go above and beyond what your obligations are in certain areas. But we need to think collectively about how we balance that. And then more importantly, I think appropriately put some of those obligations or think about meaningful obligations on others. I mean, company formation is a great example, right? I mean, it would certainly help everyone if there were something there.
More transparency there. So we'll go to Sandy, and then there are a number of questions we'll come to. So right next to you. Yep, thanks.
Thank you. I was hoping that we might get Danny Glaser to sort of reinforce his recent comment just a moment ago about the distinction between the broad economic pressure on the one hand and the transaction-by-transaction efforts on the other. It seems to me there's a constant, what's the right word, magnetism that exists where people who speak about proliferation finance always begin with the individual transactions, the ball bearings that wound up in one of the missiles in North Korea or whatever it might be, and to sort of come lately, come at the end of the discussion to the high-level sanctions that are attempting to weaken the North Korean economy, bring them to the table, and so forth. And even within the FATF discussion, there are public statements by the FATF that focus on the overall economies of the two countries. They dictate that every bank around the world is supposed to exercise at a minimum enhanced due diligence, and in some cases really stop transactions, in the case of North Korea. And I guess the issue is, when we discuss this topic in many settings, do we get the priorities backwards? Should we be focusing on the broader economic leverage versus attempts to screen transactions at an individual bank looking for dual-use goods?
I'm just going to say, I'm not going to let you say we must do both.
Well, no, it's what I said before. So I'll say we must do both in a different way then. When I opened up my remarks, I said that sanctions are not a policy, sanctions are a tool. So when you look at the issue of whatever the issue is that you're looking at, North Korea proliferation, sanctions need to be a part of that tool, and there needs to be in combination with intelligence efforts, with law enforcement efforts, with diplomatic efforts, with targeted financial efforts, and with sort of systemic financial efforts. What the systemic financial efforts do is they set the backdrop, and this is why I disagree with your characterization of why BDA was effective. Why BDA was effective was Banco Delta Asia, which was a bank in Macau that the Treasury Department targeted to great impact. Some people think positive impact, some people think negative impact, but in any case, to great impact. The reason why BDA, I think, was effective, because it goes directly to this question, was precisely because in the years leading up to BDA, we had set up this global AML regime throughout the world that banks were responsive to. So when they looked and saw what happened to BDA, there was this systemic ripple effect throughout the system, which deterred banks from dealing with North Korea, and which effectively very quickly froze North Korea overtly out of the international financial system. And that was enormously powerful and quite surprising to the North Koreans and frankly to the United States as well. We were all surprised, and we're no longer surprised, but we were surprised at how effective the international anti-money laundering system was. So it's very important. However, once you do that, you're still left with the things that you were referring to and that Norm was referring to, which again is the cat and mouse game of figuring out where the individual, and I don't say cat and mouse game in a negative way, figuring out with intel and with law enforcement, where are they covertly accessing the system, and then that becomes more of a question of political will and diplomacy and really hard financial leverage when you find that stuff to put your finger on that, whether it's a particular leadership account at a particular bank somewhere or it's a particular proliferation-related transaction somewhere.
Do you want to say anything on this one? Or no? No. Okay, moving on. So we're gonna let's take the two of your questions there, and actually let's take them together.
Yeah, I'll try and make this quick. Hi, Jack Margolin from the Center for Advanced Defense Studies. Sandy, I'm actually glad you asked that because it saves me having to try and ask the very difficult question about regime finance versus proliferation finance. So I think that anybody here would agree that we would consider a bank's compliance system deficient if they were failing to conduct basic customer due diligence, if they're failing to basically know their customers, if they're regularly processing trade finance transactions that were clearly under, over invoiced, etc. And in my awareness, there's no such standard for proliferation finance. Obviously, we have the standards that we've established through sanctions, but I cannot point to an international standard outside of something that would be, say, mentioned in 1540.
Which is to say the
United Nations Security Council Resolution 1540.
Yes. Okay, keep going.
Thank you. That would give us the grounds in order to say, look, this financial institution has clearly failed to apply the standards for pattern recognition or anomaly detection that are necessary to counter proliferation finance. We have those for AML. To a certain extent, we have them for CFT. What do you think is necessary to establish those standards, and whose responsibility is that? Is that something that we should consider to be the realm of FATF or Treasury?
That's a great question. Let's take the next one too, and then turn to, and these are good people to ask that question of. Yeah.
Peter Harrell with CNAS. Sarah, I actually wanted to come back to something you said and play devil's advocate for a minute to hear what your response is, because I think you walk through the situation where you think it's crazy that you can't see as a banker, Credit Suisse, all of what one of your customers may be doing globally. And I think we often have that view in these kind of discussions where we're talking about proliferation finance and sanctions. This does seem crazy. But I'd like to play devil's advocate a little bit on that and ask how you think you should think about the privacy issues there, right? Because it does seem crazy when you put it that way. On the other hand, if I was a Swiss financial regulator and I'm thinking about, do I really want an American ex-government official in Washington, D.C. reviewing my Swiss citizens' financial transactions? They may pass them to the U.S. government with no judicial process. I also see in the news the U.S. government has recently been leaking SAR filings to the press and high-profile cases like Michael Cohen. And meanwhile, I also see this global trend toward privacy where we're looking in Europe and now in the U.S. about massive new privacy regulations on big tech companies. I think it is actually a more serious issue than we tend to give credit to in these kinds of conversations. And I think until we in this community, the kind of sanctions and non-pro community, have a thoughtful, considered, and adequate response on the privacy issues, we're unlikely to get the kind of legal change that would make that kind of information sharing legally easier across jurisdictions. I'm just curious how you think about that issue.
So I will just say what we're going to do is we'll respond here, and we're going to do one more round, sort of briefly, and one more round of all of, I saw about 3 or 4 questions we're going to wrap together, and we'll end on time, giving everyone the opportunity to say a last word. So
So if I can I'll start with Peter and then I'll respond to the other on the 1542. So look, you're right, and I think it is important. I don't mean to be flippant about data privacy issues and the reason that there are data privacy regulations in place to protect our information. I feel that way very strongly, as I think we all should do, and it's obviously it's a front page issue all the time. I think the distinction, however, needs to be made in the context of what should be defined exceptions to that, and within the data privacy, the GDPR, they don't actually define what those are, and I think ultimately there has to be a defined universe of, in the context of money laundering, terrorist financing, which in the current regime is all it would be, an ability to share. Now, practically, to answer your question, Credit Suisse is unique because we're based in Switzerland and all information can come to Switzerland. Nothing can leave Switzerland because of our bank secrecy laws. However, it will actually provide us one central place where that information can be held and as appropriate shared. And as I mentioned, this process that we're undertaking in this system is going to be very complicated. Basically, depending on what the laws are in different jurisdictions, different people will be able to see certain information, and in many circumstances, there'll have to be a call made to Switzerland and some sort of discussion, a difficult discussion in terms of what can be shared. So at the end of the day, we will abide by the data privacy and bank secrecy laws first, but allowing us as an institution to actually understand risk. I mean, again, the most obvious examples to me are scenarios in which the bank has made a decision in one jurisdiction to exit a client, but we maintain that client somewhere else because there's no communication about that. So just at a high level, and it could have been because of something quite egregious, but there's no ability to communicate that. So that's the most obvious example, but I don't mean to be flippant about that at all. In terms of your question on 1540, that goes back to sort of where we started, which is the Financial Action Task Force is under the leadership of the U.S. presidency of the FATF is looking to do just this, to expand and look at whether or not we can expand the international obligations at FATF to require jurisdictions, then ultimately covered financial institutions, to actually look at things specifically in the context of proliferation financing. I personally feel very strongly it should sit with FATF. I personally feel very strongly it has to be a global standard. Because at the end of the day, in the U.S., the way we think about PF, banks do that, right? So again, they are using their CDD obligations, as I mentioned earlier, as the foundation to effectively implement a sanctions program. And that's what the expectations here are.
Sit with FATF versus 1540?
Well, I think a global obligation needs to come out of FATF.
Okay.
But I agree 1540 is the only hook at the moment in terms of how we think of things, because everything in FATF related to PF and TF, PF is all directly, currently from UN sanctions obligations.
Thank you. Okay, so we are going to, just remind me here, we had, okay, we'll come to the front, and actually let's start there. Thank you. And then we'll come to you. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you very much. I'm John from Radio Free Asia in Washington, D.C. One quick question. In the second summit of Trump and Kim Jong-un is in February, I think. The sanction matter is kind of one key agenda on the table. So what is going to be the deadline for the Trump administration to agree with you in the summit? Yes.
And then let's take a question from here. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Katie Strohmeyer. I'm interested in if you have any ideas for legislative solutions for countering proliferation financing other than beneficial ownership and information sharing suggestions, which are great, but just additional ones. Thank you.
Thanks, Katie. And in the front?
Hi, I'm Roman Singh, CrowdStrike. I have quite a few questions, but I'll try to keep them brief. So on the North Korean side, are we starting to see North Korea expanding its international trade agreements with other countries in a way to finance some sort of their nuclear program? Secondly, are we starting to see them use industrial espionage in a way to also counteract any kind of sanctions efforts that we might put on them? Lastly, for the Iranian side, are we starting to see Iran use more e-crime and cryptocurrency efforts to kind of bypass sanction efforts from the United States and globally?
The last one was for Iran?
Yes, correct.
Yeah, okay, great. So now we'll take your comments, and then at the end give you a chance to say any last word you want to say. Norm, do you want to go?
Mine is the quickest. On Iran, we've had a lot of discussion on banking regulations and big part strategy and so forth. But the initial presentation talked about transportation nodes and other nodes where finance comes into play. The administration has just sanctioned Keshem Airlines, an airline that appears to have been set up for only one purpose: to deliver weapons, people, and bad things to Bashar al-Assad. The banking capacity under that is equally susceptible to sanctions. In their cyber industry, the Iranians have been, for the Department of Justice, responsible for stealing $350 billion worth of intellectual property from 100 universities and companies over a 3-year period. There were banks who sustained that cyber industry in Iran. So they have not engaged in cryptocurrency and other issues, although they have used some of that to pay what I believe to be Russian dark side hackers to provide them with tools. But again, bankers sustain the Iranian cyber industry. And so when you think of proliferation, they acquire data technology through proliferation through a cyber tool that isn't, again, it's a very complex discussion, but we didn't spend a lot of time on that today, and I suspect North Korea probably does the same.
Thank you. Is there anything else you want to say in a broad brush? Actually, may I just ask you to opine on the question of, with regard to Iran, the role for broad-based policy and regulation versus, which may be a job for policymakers, legislators, versus the work of a narrower set in intelligence and law enforcement going after the particular entities, or kind of the catching individual actors.
So with no derogation meant to either my colleagues or anyone in the area, there's almost it's a little bit humorous to think about it that way. You have a country which aggressively works to acquire missile technology and other technologies for malign purposes, but somehow we think if the Iranian Majlis passes a rule that the IRGC and the rest of the country that have done this for years are going to stop. Likewise, that if the issue of missiles, which the Russians I mentioned earlier have a very different view of what is nuclear capable under the various UN resolutions, that somehow if there's an international agreement that Vladimir Putin is going to suddenly say, I have a different view on those issues. I think these are incredibly useful. I mentioned early on, this can even be my closing comment, that this was a complex issue, but the topography was very simple. You heard how complex it is, and I'm not trying to oversimplify it, but the IRGC isn't going away in Iran, and that has real-world ramifications that will go beyond whatever FATF does, whatever we do in the UN, whatever we do with Chinese or Turkish banks or Russian banks, and that's part of the cat and mouse game that will go on for a long time. And the ramifications, going into the first question asked, is there will be genuine suffering in Iran because banks and countries will very legitimately say, how do I deal with Iran knowing that every bill of lading I get, every customer I've got may well be doing nefarious activity for which I might get a multi-billion-dollar fine from the United States in 3 years. Best I not deal with that tiny market and go somewhere else.
Should we take the North Korea questions? Or
sure. I kind of feel like you were looking at me when you asked that question. I don't know. This is my honest answer. With respect to the legislation question, honestly, the most important thing Congress could do is on the beneficial ownership side. I mean, this is the point that I was making before. Is I thought it was an excellent report, but the biggest recommendations that come out of that report are on the traditional anti-money laundering side with respect to beneficial ownership, with respect to things like that. I think it's really important. I thought we were really, really close, sort of somewhere towards the end of the Obama administration, and we never got there. It was very disappointing. And I hope we get there sometime, because it's really the most important thing. Now, since you really want something else, I will say that, and this was going to go to some of my sort of more general comments, and I think actually relevant to the interchange between Peter and Sarah, is on technology. And artificial intelligence and the use of technology in compliance, and I think it's already revolutionizing the way banks approach their illicit finance compliance, and it's going to continue to do so. And 5-10 years from now, it's going to be almost unrecognizable as to what it's like today. And I think that Congress has an important role to play, and the administration has an important role to play in facilitating that and giving financial institutions the space that they need. And I think this is even covered a little bit in the report, giving them the space that they need in order to implement innovative technology that's going to allow them to be much more efficient and much more effective at a lower cost than what they have to do now. And I think there really should be a panel just on that subject alone. And even that panel wouldn't exhaust it, but that's a really, really important set of issues. And if people at Treasury Department I know are focused on it, if people are on the Hill are focused on it, then I think really, really important stuff could come out of that. With respect to cyber currency, look, cyber currency certainly presents a risk. I don't think, again, there's a lot of information that there's a large amount of sanctions violations. I think it's much more of a criminal issue at this point rather than a sanctions busting issue at this point. But sure, as I said, looking at the systemic side versus the targeted side, it does provide opportunities for illicit actors to engage in specific transactions. But I think sort of from a broad level, we haven't, maybe somebody wants to disagree with that, but I certainly haven't seen, there's a huge risk associated with cyber currency, but I really haven't seen a lot beyond speculation on the sanctions busting side. And I was actually going to end with the artificial intelligence thing, so that will conclude.
So, Sarah, to the last word from you. Do you want to? Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I'm really sorry. I feel like we've covered a lot of ground.
May I just ask you then too whether you want to affirm or go in a different direction to talk about the legislative ideas point?
Right.
Because you are, you could be humble if you want, but you are well placed to speak to that, having thought a lot about that in your professional career.
I failed.
No.
No, Sarah did not fail. Sarah was the most important person in the United States government.
No, look, this goes back to two things. The first is transparency, right? It's basic. It's 101. Whenever I talk about AML to the non-initiated, some of which may be here, it's fundamentally about who you're doing business with. That's it. And we need as many tools and resources to help us do that as we can. I think I will then just pick up on Danny's point. One of the coolest things about being at Credit Suisse now is that we actually employ 40 data scientists within the compliance department who are building all of our own systems for AML. We're not buying anything, we're building everything in order to, and really develop thoughtful pieces, but it's a really cool thing to be part of. And part of it is about employing some new things like AI, but others just putting some pieces together and bringing information together. The other big issue that banks face is data integration. So, as globally most institutions have grown through acquisition, no bank in my experience has spent money on actually bringing all their data together. So imagine what that means just from a sanction screening perspective. It's incredibly painful. So when we talk about like this enterprise-wide view, the first thing we had to do was actually bring all of our data to one place and make it uniform. That's a disaster in and of itself. So there are just very foundational, simple issues that banks face in terms of addressing these issues.
But there's all sorts of legal issues that go along with even the things that you're talking about, relating to some of the stuff that Peter was talking about.
Huge,
So just to close, I will say one of my takeaways from this point is that there are a very few global financial institutions and governments that have the capacity and the budget to be able to encounter and to really take on those difficult challenges with respect to bringing together the data and understanding who their customers are, which means that leaves everybody else in the dark about, which means other countries and other financial institutions, which again, from a public policy perspective, leaves a big gap where there's an opportunity to try and think and do more with regard to policy, technical assistance, and at a minimum discussing the issue as we've done today. So I hope that we can continue this conversation with all of you and other technical experts in the audience and on our panel. Please all join me in thanking our panel with a round of applause.